The river was still that morning, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like time has stopped breathing. A fisherman named Yuri drifted close to shore, his oars dipping softly into the black water. He had fished these parts of Siberia for years, but that day his net caught something heavier than fish. When he pulled it up, the stench hit first, not of rot, but of iron and earth, the scent of something old pulled from a place that wanted it hidden. Among the tangled reeds lay a boot, the leather stiff with age, and a jawbone bleached white by decades of frost. The locals told stories about that place, a nameless island swallowed by fog and silence. They said the government once sent people there and never spoke of them again. But Yuri didn't believe in ghosts. Not until he found the book. It was wrapped in cloth, sealed with wax that had cracked like dried skin. The cover was a dark brown, soft and worn, the leather flaking beneath his touch. A diary. Inside, the ink had faded to the color of old blood, but the name was still clear: Anya Sokolova. Historians arrived weeks later, drawn by the whispers of what Yuri had found. The coordinates matched a place once recorded as Nazino, though on every map after 1933, the name had been erased. The archives mentioned a relocation project, thousands of prisoners sent north to settle the land. None returned. The locals called it Cannibal Island. Most assumed the story was propaganda, a cruel legend to scare the living. But the diary changed everything. It began softly, like a love story written in exile. Anya spoke of her husband Ivan, a man she called the last good thing in a world gone mad. She wrote about the journey upriver, the bitter wind, the guards who looked away as people fell overboard. She wrote about how Ivan held her hand and promised that when they reached the island, they would start over, a home by the pines, a life rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. But, as the pages went on, her handwriting changed. It began to tilt, words trembling like someone writing in the dark. She described nights when the wind howled through the trees and voices rose from the shore, cries of hunger, prayers, something else she couldn't name. Then she mentioned Ivan leaving after sunset, returning with food he never explained. The final line of the first entry stopped every historian cold. It was simple, almost tender. He promised we stood eat together forever. That was where the ink ended, but the silence it left behind was louder than any scream. The diary had been buried deep beneath the island's soil, preserved by cold and secrecy, waiting for someone to listen. And now that it had been found, something about the air around Nazino seemed to change. The fog thickened, birds stopped flying over the shore. It was as if the island itself had been disturbed, and for the first time in nearly a century, it had begun to remember. Before the island, there was music. Anya Sokolova's hands once moved across piano keys in a small schoolhouse in Moscow. Her students gathered in rows, their voices rising with the winter light. She wrote about that time with a kind of fragile fondness, the smell of chalk dust, the echo of laughter, the feel of her husband's coat brushing hers as they walked home through the snow. But the world around them was tightening. The arrests began quietly. A whisper here, a missing neighbor there. Ivan was accused first, not of crime, but of thinking. The wrong thought, spoken to the wrong ear. He was sentenced to exile in the north. Anya married him the week before his deportation. It was not love at first. It was desperation disguised as devotion. Marriage was her only protection from the same fate. She admitted that in her early pages, ashamed, but honest. "He loved me enough to save me," she wrote, "and I loved him enough to pretend." They were sent to Nazino with thousands of others, packed onto barges that smelled of sweat and death. The guards shouted orders like curses, their faces hollow from cold and fear. The prisoners clung to each other as the river swallowed the days. When they reached the island, there were no houses, no tools, no food, just snow, wind, and endless water. They were told supplies would come. They never did. The first nights were full of coughing and prayers. People froze where they slept, their bodies stiff as the ground they lay on. Anya's early entries spoke of hope, how Ivan built her a shelter from branches, how they shared the last crust of bread like communion. She wrote that they sang quietly to drown out the screams from the other camps along the shore. He said we must keep the heart alive, she noted. If we lose that, we lose everything. But soon the words began to darken. The snow melted, revealing bodies the frost had hidden. Hunger spread like a fever. They boiled bark and grass, even leather from their shoes. Then Ivan began to disappear at night. He would return before dawn, his hands trembling, his coat heavy with frost, and something else. Meat. He said it came from the guards, from the river, from luck. But the smell told another story. Whispers began to move through the camps. They said couples were surviving longer, that a man and woman together could do things no one else dared. The guards looked away, pretending not to see what the fires were cooking. The air itself began to change, sweet, metallic, wrong. Anya Seps's entries became fractured. Hesitant. He looks at me like I am something he could save or consume, she wrote. Sometimes I wake, and his hand is on my throat, not in anger, but in wonder, as if he is deciding which kind of love this will be. The night she confronted him, the diary described no shouting, no struggle, just a quiet conversation by the dying fire. She asked him where the meat came from. He smiled softly, brushed her hair back, and said, "For better or worse, my love, this is both." She didn't write again for 3 days. When she did, her handwriting had changed completely, smaller, colder, as if she were someone else. "The island teaches what vows really mean," she wrote. "Hunger is the only truth left." And from that point on, her story stopped feeling human. It began to feel like confession. The wind had begun to sound like breathing. It moved through the trees at night, soft and uneven, as if something unseen exhaled just beyond the firelight. Anya wrote that the air itself seemed alive, thick with the scent of smoke and decay. The survivors huddled in clusters now, eyes sunken, lips grey, their voices breaking when they spoke of food. Every night, more fires burned inland, their smoke twisting upward in narrow columns that looked too controlled to be accidents. Ivan told her he had found a way to survive, that there was still hope if she trusted him. But the way he said it made her chest tighten. She followed him once, she confessed. He thought she was asleep, but she waited until his footsteps faded, and then trailed him through the trees. The snow reflected the moon in dull silver patches, lighting her path in flashes. The further she went, the stronger the smell became, not rot, but something cooked, mixed with pine resin and ash. She wrote that her legs trembled, that part of her wanted to turn back, but curiosity, or love, kept her moving. When she reached the clearing, she thought at first she had stumbled into a graveyard. The fire in the center burned low and steady, and above it hung shapes that glimmered in the dim light. Bones, dozens of them, stripped and bleached, swinging from the branches like ornaments. The snow below was dark, heavy with melted fat. Around the fire sat a circle of figures, people she had once known from the camp. Their faces were blank, their eyes downturned, their hands red. At the head of the circle stood Ivan. He looked different now, thinner, his expression calm in a way that frightened her more than rage could. He spoke softly, almost reverently, calling the place the communion of the living. He told them that those who had died were still feeding them, still keeping them alive, that in this way no one truly left the island. "We are not monsters," he said. "We are one body, one spirit. They live through us." The others nodded, some weeping, some smiling. Anya's breath caught. She tried to step back, but her boot snapped a twig beneath her, and every head turned. Ivan's eyes met hers across the fire. He didn't shout or chase her. He only smiled. She ran anyway, branches slapping her face, her lungs burning. She wrote that she didn't know if he followed until she felt his hand close around her wrist. He didn't hurt her. He pulled her close, his voice almost tender. "You made vows," he whispered. "You said until death. You think this is death?" His lips brushed her ear. "No, my love. This is after." When she returned to their shelter, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next entry in the diary was smeared, as if her tears had mixed with blood or melted snow. Her sentences broke apart midway, words trailing into nothing. "The flesh smells like pine," she wrote. "He says I must learn to love what keeps me alive." The handwriting ended there, uneven and frantic. The rest of the page was blank, except for a single fingerprint pressed into the corner, dark, oval, and perfectly preserved. The ink analysis later confirmed it wasn't hers. The snow no longer fell in silence. It came down in soft, whispering sheets, as though the sky itself was mourning. Anya wrote that the island had begun to breathe differently, that the ground pulsed faintly beneath her feet, warm in places where no fire burned. The people who remained were shadows of their former selves, drifting between hunger and madness. Some crawled toward the river, believing salvation waited across the water. None returned. The guards had long since vanished, their boats gone, their orders forgotten. There was no authority now, no God, no mercy, only the island and the rules it had made for them. Anya's writing changed with the days. The trembling fear of her early entries gave way to something eerily calm, almost reverent. She began describing the world through Ivan's eyes, through the logic he'd created to justify their survival. She wrote that she started helping him find the willing, though she never explained what that meant. In one passage, she described approaching a young man, telling him there was bread near the pines, that Ivan had saved it. When the man followed her, she wrote that she could not bear to watch what happened next. But then she added a line that made historians stop reading aloud for a moment. "I prayed for him, and in that prayer, I felt clean." Days blended together. Hunger lost its shape, turning into something almost sacred. She began to speak of the offering, of the giving of flesh to keep the soul whole. Her guilt dissolved into ritual, her shame into faith. She no longer referred to Ivan as her husband, at least, not by name. Instead, she called him the husband of the island. The words carried a strange devotion, as if she believed he was part of the land now, a vessel through which the island fed. "He listens to its heartbeat," she wrote. "He knows when it wants more." There was one entry, dated weeks after her discovery of the clearing, that stood apart from the rest. Her handwriting was small and steady, the ink darker than before, as if she had written it in the middle of the night. He said, "I must understand what love means when everything else is gone," she began. "That to share his burden is to share his truth." She described sitting by the fire, the smell of cooked flesh rising into the cold. She didn't say whose it was, only that she took a single bite, closed her eyes, and felt closer to him than ever. From that point on, her writing read more like scripture than confession. Each page blurred into prayer, the same words repeating again and again. "The island feeds. The island forgives." Her tone softened, almost peaceful, as though she had surrendered entirely to its rhythm. The final page of the diary stopped, mid-sentence. The last words were faint, scrawled across the bottom corner, as if written in haste. "He is calling from the trees. I must." The rest was gone. The ink dragged across the paper in a long, broken line. The pen had torn through the page. Whatever interrupted her, it came without warning. When the patrol boats finally reached Nazino, the island no longer looked real. From the river, it seemed to float, a strip of grey earth surrounded by a fog so dense it swallowed sound. The soldiers called out, but no one answered. They expected to find a camp, perhaps a few starving settlers. What they found instead were the remains of 6,000 souls reduced to a handful of figures moving like ghosts among the trees. The smell hit before the sight, smoke ash, and something else they couldn't name. It clung to their clothes, their hair, their thoughts. One of the men, a medic named Pavel, wrote in his report that the ground was soft with bones. They crunched beneath their boots, like twigs. The snow was streaked with dark patches, thawing around what used to be fires. In the center of it all, by a pile of stones and blackened wood, sat a woman. Her hair was white with frost, her dress torn, her hands wrapped around a bundle of cloth. She stared into the ashes as if the fire still burned. When they asked her name, she spoke quietly, almost politely. Anya Sokolova. The sound of it silenced the group. One of the officers recognized it, the name from the recovered diary. He knelt beside her and asked where her husband was. She smiled faintly, her lips cracked and bleeding. "He's here," she said. "He never left. He's in the trees now." At first, they thought she was delirious. The medic tried to take the bundle from her hands, but she tightened her grip until her knuckles split. Inside the cloth were fragments of bone, carefully wrapped, polished by touch. When they tried to move her, she whispered something in a language none of them recognized, though one soldier swore it wasn't Russian at all, that it sounded older, almost sung. As they prepared the survivors for transport, a storm rolled in without warning. The wind tore through the pines with a sound like a scream. One soldier later wrote in his personal notebook, not in the report, that the trees seemed to move, that the trunks swayed not from wind, but breath. He said he saw faces carved into the bark, hundreds of them, their mouths open, their eyes inlaid with something pale and round. He thought they were stones until he looked closer. They were teeth. Anya was the last to be loaded onto the boat. She didn't resist, but she kept glancing toward the forest as if waiting for someone. "He's watching," she said softly. "He doesn't like strangers touching me." The others laughed nervously, though no one met her eyes. Halfway downriver, she began to hum, a slow, hollow tune that none of the men could identify. Then she fell silent. By morning, her body was gone. No splash had been heard, no struggle seen. The diary she carried vanished with her. The official report listed both as lost in transit. Years later, Pavel returned to the archives, hoping to find mention of her case. The file was sealed. The label read only one word: classified. He closed the drawer, but he never stopped hearing that hum, a low, steady note that rose whenever the wind passed through the pines. The file was discovered by accident. In 2018, a graduate researcher named Irina Volkova was scanning mislabeled Soviet records for a digital preservation project. Most of the files were dull: shipping manifests, census sheets, faded maps. Then, deep in a folder marked Agricultural Losses, Western Siberia, she found something that didn't belong. Nazino case. Exhibit 7A. The folder was thin, but its edges were stained with something that looked like rust. Inside, she found one brittle photograph and a scan of a single diary page. Across the top, written in trembling cursive, was a name she recognized immediately from urban legends and forbidden archives: Anya Sokolova. The paper was warped, watermarked by age, yet the writing remained dark enough to read. The first lines were a jumble of unfinished thoughts, references to trees, to warmth under the soil, to voices that feed when the moon is small. But at the bottom, just before the ink bled into nothing, there was one final sentence. It read, "I am still his wife. The island feeds us both." Irina froze. She had grown up hearing stories of Cannibal Island as exaggerated propaganda, something whispered about in school hallways. But this was first-hand testimony. She scanned the document and sent it for analysis, unaware that her message would set off a quiet panic among the historians who received it. Within weeks, the file was removed from the archive's online database without explanation. A year later, a scientific team from Tomsk University was granted limited access to the original excavation remains from Nazino. Their goal was simple: to test and catalogue genetic material from the victims for historical record. But what they found defied science. The samples pulled from separate burial sites, skulls, ribs, even teeth, showed identical mitochondrial strands. Not similar. Identical. It was as if the DNA had copied itself from a single source and spread through multiple bodies. At first, they blamed contamination, but the controls were clean. They ran the tests again, and the results didn't change. It was as though every body buried there had begun to merge at a cellular level, their identities dissolving into one. One of the researchers, in a private email later leaked, wrote, "We are not looking at decomposition, we are looking at integration." The ministry called the findings inconclusive, sealing the data within months. But rumors spread among the team. They spoke of faint anomalies in the lab, the sound of paper rustling when no air moved, the smell of pine even in sterilized rooms. Irina, who had found the original diary scan, was later interviewed for a documentary that never aired. Her final statement was brief. "Some places don't want to be remembered," she said. "They remember us instead." Today, Nazino is a forbidden zone, though that doesn't stop travelers from trying to reach it. The river's course has shifted over the decades, leaving only fragments of the original island above water. But every year, a few boats drift close enough to glimpse the trees still standing. Visitors claim to hear whispers through the fog, soft, rhythmic, almost human. They say if you stay long enough, the pines begin to move in unison, swaying not with the wind, but with breath. One fisherman who camped there in 2021 described waking to find teeth scattered around his tent like frost. Another claimed he saw figures standing between the trees at dawn, two shapes fused at the chest, motionless, watching. When investigators reviewed his footage, the final frame showed what appeared to be faces in the bark, overlapping like layers of flesh. Locals say the island never died. It adapted. That the marriage between Anya and her husband was only the beginning. They call it the communion tree, a living union of those who refused to let death separate them. When the wind moves across the river, you can almost hear her voice beneath it, whispering the vow she wrote long ago. "I am still his wife." The island feeds us both.